Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're not going to be looking at emperors or grand battles or those sweeping political events. Instead, we are stepping right into the gritty, everyday reality of ancient Roman life. We're going to explore the actual physical machinery of how a human mind was forged in the ancient world, literally down to the sounds, the smells, and the textures of a child's freezing cold morning routine. Let's dive in.
So think about this for a second. How did a civilization without modern numbers or paper manage a vast empire? It's a fascinating question, right? We rely on silicon chips, endless reams of paper, and digital calculators just to run our daily lives. But the Romans, they managed this sprawling intercontinental empire of millions, coordinating massive trade, military logistics, epic engineering projects without any of that. So how did they pull it off? Well, the answer actually isn't found in grand Senate buildings. It's found in the small, physical, and honestly, surprisingly brutal tools placed into the hands of children.
Section 1. Dawn at the Ludus. Let's look at early education.
Now, if you really want to understand a civilization, you've got to look at how it raises its young. I want you to imagine it's just before sunrise. The light is super dim, the air is freezing cold, and a young, vulnerable child arrives at the Ludus Literarius. That's the basic Roman elementary school. But don't picture a quiet, modern classroom here. These classes were often held outdoors or just in simple, rented rooms separated from the noisy, chaotic street by nothing but a curtain. And the teacher, known as the Ludi Magister or literator, they were usually a freedman or a slave. They held practically zero social standing and were paid terribly. And the sensory environment of this space, man, it was utterly overwhelming. It was just dominated by this loud, repetitive noise of students chanting their letters over and over in rote memorization.
And trust me, if that chanting stopped, the consequences were severe. Discipline in the Ludus was notoriously strict. It utilized an ascending hierarchy of really harsh beatings. There is basically no room for a questioning young mind or personal initiative. Your reward was simply the absence of punishment. And this is a profound historical contradiction we really have to grapple with. The very foundation of one of history's most highly structured and civilized societies was literally built upon brutal corporal punishment and the constant, everyday fear of the teacher's cane.
Section 2. Wax, Wood, and Bone. Let's look at the tools of the trade.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand this system, we have to look closely at the physical objects these kids held tightly in their cold hands. A student didn't just throw on a backpack, they brought a theta. This was a small wooden carrying case, and inside you wouldn't find notebooks or paper. No way. You'd find reusable wax tablets, a small sponge for cleaning, a sharpening knife, and a ruler. This was the absolute essential survival kit for a Roman student, and it completely grounds us in the material culture of the era.
The primary tool in that kit was the wax tablet, or ceres. Picture this, a hollowed-out block of boxwood or sandorak wood, filled with a thin layer of dark beeswax that had been tempered with resin or turpentine so it wouldn't crack. Students would take a stylus, which was made of metal, wood, or bone, and use the sharp point to literally scratch their letters right into the dark wax. Made a mistake? No problem. You simply flip the stylus over to its flat, spatula-like end and smooth the wax right out. And at the end of the day, you could heat the metal stylus over a small flame and melt the wax completely flat. It was basically the ancient world's infinitely reusable tablet, a real game changer for them.
Now, you might be wondering, why not just use paper? Well, papyrus had to be imported all the way from Egypt. It was incredibly expensive, super fragile, and strictly reserved for the really advanced students who had already mastered penmanship. Wax tablets, on the other hand, were the practical, economic solution. In fact, economic constraints were so tight back then that poorer students often used ostraca. These were broken, discarded shards of street pottery that they'd just pick up to scratch out their daily homework. Pretty wild, right?
Section 3. The Calculus of Empire. Roman Numerosity.
So we've covered reading and writing, but what about numeracy? The engine that literally sustained Roman commerce and military dominance was the Roman abacus. Early humans used loose pebbles, which were called calculi in Latin, on a flat board, but the Romans upgraded this by placing slidable beads into fixed grooves. They used what's called a biquinary-coded decimal system. The upper, shorter grooves held beads representing fives. The lower, longer grooves held beads representing ones. It even had special grooves on the side for calculating specific Roman fractions and ounces. And this brilliantly illustrates how the physical tool worked. If you look closely at how the 5s and 1s are split on the abacus, you can actually see how this directly translated into the written Roman numeral system of V's and I's.
We know for sure that these tools were deeply intertwined in everyday Roman life. Back in the 1st century BC, the famous poet Horace actually wrote about the wax abacus. He described a board covered with a thin layer of black wax where columns and figures were inscribed using a stylus. So, you see, mathematics and the wax tablet were completely inseparable in the Roman mind. They were a package deal.
And when we zoom out from that single shivering student in a morning classroom, we realize something incredible. The abacus and the wax tablet were the micromechanics of Roman macro power. Every single military supply chain, every massive aqueduct, every single grain shipment crisscrossing the Mediterranean, all of it was calculated and administered by human minds that were trained entirely on these simple physical objects.
Section 4. The Stratified Classroom. Let's dig into the social realities.
But we have to ask, who actually got to use these tools? Because unlike today, there was no free, universal public schooling in Rome. Education was fiercely segregated by wealth and by gender. Wealthy boys were groomed basically from birth for secondary education, fully destined for politics and the Senate. But for girls and for lower-class boys, the path was entirely different. Lower-class boys quickly moved into heavy physical labor or apprenticeships. And girls, well, even the wealthy ones were generally excluded from public secondary education. Instead, they were taught household management, things like spinning and weaving, and were prepared for early marriage, sometimes when they were as young as 12 years old.
Because of this intense social stratification, historians estimate that at the absolute height of the empire, only about 10% of the city of Rome was literate. Just think about that for a second. That means in a sprawling, bustling metropolis of 1 million people, 900,000 human beings could not read a single word of the laws that govern them. That is just staggering.
And remember earlier how I mentioned that teachers were terribly paid? Well, to put a number on it, by AD 301, the Emperor Diocletian issued an edict fixing the absolute maximum salary for a secondary teacher at just 200 denarii per pupil per month. The very men tasked with molding the minds of the empire's next generation were, in reality, often barely scraping by.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how they actually tested these kids. Assessment in this environment was entirely public, on the spot, and incredibly high pressure. There were no formal, quiet paper exams that the teacher graded in private. Nope, a student had to stand up and perform bilingually in both Latin and Greek, right in front of their peers and a highly demanding teacher. This environment bred an intensely competitive aristocratic class. Education here wasn't just about learning facts for the fun of it. It was literally a mechanism of social control designed to weed people out and maintain elite stability.
Section 5. Forging a Roman citizen. The assembly line of the elite.
This entire process was the ultimate assembly line of Roman elite citizenship. For the privileged few who actually made it all the way through, the educational arc was grueling. At age 7, they survived the harsh beatings and rote memorization of the ludus. Then, by age 12, they moved up to the Grammaticus, where they analyzed Greek and Latin poetry, history, and mythology. Finally, in their late teens, they studied under a rhetor, and this is where they mastered advanced public speaking, law, and the absolute art of persuasion. You see, every single wax tablet scratched, every single abacus bead slid into place, and every public humiliation endured served one singular purpose. The ultimate goal of Roman education was never about personal self-actualization or, finding your passion, not at all. It was completely designed to forge an effective, persuasive, and incredibly tough public speaker. They were building a highly productive, resilient cog for the great Roman societal machine. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. Did this brutal, highly stratified, and intensely competitive education system create the Roman Empire? Or did the sheer survival needs of a massive, militaristic empire demand the creation of such a harsh system in the first place? It's a fascinating chicken and egg question about how everyday childhood experiences directly shape the destiny of an entire civilization. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today. I really hope it leaves you looking at a simple piece of wax or a wooden bead in a completely new light.